finishes here. In with the main one, we have to move that out to get to the 3rd century stuff, and then we've got a freestanding independent structure on the end there. And that's a classic sort of Roman building for the officers' quarters in there. So we reckon that probably the centurion or the man in charge of some of these cavalry troops has been living in there in the 4th century. And really we've only gone down to its flat floor, we haven't really analysed the material on that just at the moment, so that's going to be good fun at some stage in the future. Now there's a couple of really important things that have come out of this 4th century building. First of all, we found over 50 iron arrowheads from its floor. Now they haven't just been concentrated in one little area, they've just been scattered all over the place in little individual bits. Now 50 probably doesn't sound like all that many, but if I explain that in 45 years of archaeology at the rest of the site put together we'd only found 12 prior to that, suddenly we've got a huge statistical spike in there, and it looks as if we might have had somebody firing artillery weapons in there. We've got archers in this late building. And the second big thing, really good news, is that we've got loads and loads of evidence for females living inside the building with the soldiers. I mean, talking about things like loom weights and spindle whorls. We've had endless bits of jewellery, bangles, bracelets, finger rings, earrings, hairpins, brooches, a lot of glass necklace beads that we've got. And then finally, probably the most significant one was about three or four weeks ago, I think it would be now, we've got a makeup crusher. So this thing's around about the size of my little finger in a crescent shape like that, with a little loop on the top for attachment to a textile or a leather thong that you wore around your neck. And basically they've been found all over the Roman Empire, and we've got little historical sources about them as well. What you do is you get a stone palette, you put your eye makeup on there, and then you use that as a crusher to break it down before you apply it. Now, I know you've got to be careful with gender in the modern world, but you know, there's not many of the Gallic soldiers that are going to be putting eye makeup on, I don't think so. I think it's fair to say that coupled with all the jewellery and the loom weights and spindle whorls, that we've had females living in this building as well, and in quite big numbers as well. Now that's actually really good news because it ties in beautifully with work that we've been doing in the Vicus, the village outside the fort, for the last 10 years, and all of the evidence that we've had up there suggests that by the end of the 270s, at the end of the 3rd century, law and order's breaking down. It's the same sort of time period that you get the towns in the further south in Britain are throwing defensive walls up, and that looks as if it's been abandoned. We don't have any coins after Claudius II in 270, none of the diagnostically late Roman pot types like Huncliffe and Cranbeck ware that were picking up all over the place inside the fort. And it looks to us as if there's been a bit of a population transferal, so they've given up the Vicus outside the fort as law and order's breaking down. They've brought everybody behind the defended area of the fort wall, and they've essentially all been living together inside the remodeled barracks. Probably one of the major reasons why it hasn't respected the original footprint of the 3rd century ones. If you've got more people living in there, you're going to need a bigger space. So that's quite big news as well. One other theory that we've got for it is that it is just possible that we might have a detachment of what they call the comitatenses living in here in the 4th century. Now those guys, you've got to imagine that they're the later Roman period. It's not a case of legionaries and auxiliaries in the Roman army. What you tend to have at that stage is you've got guys called limitani, who are essentially the police force of the northern frontier. Those are the guys looking after Hadrian's Wall. And then you've got this mobile field army called the comitatenses, who are basically just sent wherever there's big patches of trouble. And it's just possible, given that we've got quite a lot of artillery weapons and things in here, all these arrowheads, and you've got all of these bits of weapons and armour, and the size and shape of the barracks, that we've got at least a detachment of that mobile field army based up here in the 4th century for a short period of time. That's another area that we're starting to think about. Can't prove it beyond doubt just yet. We're only in the 2nd year of a 5-year programme, but it's indicating some of the evidence that we've got. That's where we're heading with this, I think. So that's what we've had going on in there in the 4th century, and then at some stage that's just been obliterated. They've knocked that down. And as law and order really has broken down, you're talking about the end of Roman Britain now, so the province has been told to look to itself. They've stopped being paid as a military force in 410 AD. Basically, by then, the guys that are living here are married to local girls, they're well settled, they've got kids, 2nd if not 3rd generation by that point, and we think they're turning into subsistence farmers. And essentially, they've been living on open spaces within the fort as best they can. So on things like the rampart mound, and over by the tripod especially, if you look at the bottom of the tripod, just this side of it, you can see some huge sandstone slabs. They've gone right over the top of the 4th century barrack floors. Sadly for us, they've been heavily plough damaged in the 20th century. There was a farmer down in Codley Gate that had been using this as his home field, and he's been trying to plough this lot. I mean, hats off to him is all I'll say, trying to put a plough across the top of that. Look, he must have been absolutely desperate, but sadly for us he's obliterated all the 5th and 6th century sort of stratified material from these floors, so all we've got left are the floor slabs themselves. But like I say, by that stage we think that they're sort of aceramic, they haven't got coinage, and they look as if they're turning into peasant farmers basically. So we've got, like I say, the 3 distinct layers of archaeology. So that's about where we are with it for the time being. And like I say, we're coming towards the end of the 2nd year of the 5-year programme. That's pretty much got us down to the 4th century levels. The next stage of this is that we've got to draw and photograph it within an inch of its life, get it all written up as best we can at those levels, and then we'll target individual areas to drop the floors and have a look underneath to see what state the 3rd century stuff is. Now, when I mentioned that, there's quite a few visitors go, you shouldn't be doing that, you're going to damage all the goods and everything that's in there. Well, you're absolutely right, we are. That's just a standard part of archaeology. And there's a couple of things to mitigate against that. You just point them out. I mean, things like this roadway, beautiful cobbled roadway, but if we preserved it for the public, it would last one winter, and the frost and everything that we get over there, that would just be a pile of sand and junk. It would just turn to gravel with everybody walking over it. So once we've photographed it, drawn it and written it up, we'll try and dig down underneath to get a decent date for it. But a good example of that. Let's say I was digging on the road itself over here, and I came across a coin of, let's say, I don't know, Constantine, let's say, and it was 312 AD that it was minted in. Well, happy days, we know that we've got somebody's dropped a coin there in the early 4th century. But it doesn't really help us to date that roadway. Now, once we've got that recorded and we lift it up and go down underneath, if we find the same coin, it's a lot better for dating for us, because it indicates that the cobbled surface there, the roadway, can't have been built and laid before the coin was minted in 312, if you follow us. So to actually date these things a lot tighter than we can from the material on them, we have to dive down a little bit underneath them. So it is quite destructive work. That's my biggest challenge, is deciding what we leave behind and what we stay and leave behind for visitors. At the moment, we think that the 4th century walls are probably really quite significant in the north of Britain, especially if we're right and it's got the competencies here, so we're probably going to preserve those and then just drop the gap in between the walls and have a look at the earlier levels in between where the walls are, if that makes any sense. So I think that's about where we're at with it. Does that make much sense to anybody? Yeah, a little bit, right, brilliant, good. I'm pleased about that, because it's been quite a fraught 18 months trying to work all of that lot out. I tell you what, it just probably like the same as you, it looked like a pile of stones about the start of April, and like I say, this was all just grass on April the 1st last year, so it's testament to the hard work of our volunteers over there. We get about 25 a week that come and give us a hand from all backgrounds and all walks of life all over the globe, and without their efforts and without the decent weather that we've had up to the last week or so, we wouldn't have been as far on with this. So I think we've set ourselves up quite nicely for a good 5 years of research into this area. And then standard to archaeology, in the course of doing this, we'll find another question that we didn't realise about the site, and that will probably dictate where we go and dig for the following 5 years. And that's been the standard procedure here for the last 45, and like I say, another 150 to 200 left to go. So my knees are not going to see the end of that story, that's for sure. Has anybody got any questions you would maybe like to ask about that, or about the site in general, before I go back to supervising the guys over there?
How did they first know that there was anything here? How did you...
I don't think it's really ever gone out of public consciousness, to be perfectly honest with you. We've got antiquarian accounts of the site as far back as 1702. So for example, there was an old antiquarian called Christopher Hunter. He visited Vindolanda in 1702, and he actually saw the bathhouse, which is the big building with a fence around it, just this side of the 4x4 vehicle over there, and he says it's still on its roof on. That was quite incredible, and he goes on to describe in great detail the hypercore system, the Roman central heating system, and he also says that he saw painted wall plaster which had been blackened by the smoke from its fires in the bathhouse. And then he goes on to spoil his account by saying it was an Elysium for a colony of fairies. The first part was absolutely fantastic, but quite what he'd been drinking in the local pub at lunchtime, I don't know he'd come up with that at the end. But essentially the important thing about that is that prior to the Enclosure Acts being passed in here in the back end of the 19th century, it looks as if Vindolanda has actually been relatively well intact. We're quite lucky that we're not really close to any civilised centres like Newcastle and Carlisle who come and plunder the site for stone. So apart from the field walls that have come around the area in the back end of the 19th century, there's been relatively little damage to the place, and nothing, as you can see, has been built over the top of it. So people have always known about the site. A little bit of work done in the 1930s. The headquarters building was excavated as part of the Durham University campaign in the 1930s. A little bit of the North Wall as well. And then, like I say, serious work first started with Robin Burley in the early 1970s, and it's just been rumbling on ever since then with this research agenda.
Thank you.
Is this one of the main settlements up here? Was it? with the settlements in Carlisle and Newcastle and here? Was this one of the big sort of...
No, it wasn't. I mean,
No.
this is one of the real dichotomies that we have now. Archaeologically today, it's one of the most important sites in the world because of the documents that we find and because of the rarity and the information that they contain. But I've got to be honest with you, to the Romans themselves, it was just a god-awful little hick outpost for in the back end of nowhere. And I mean, even within Hadrian's Wall itself, the two big node centres are Carlisle on the west and Corbridge on the east. The reason for that is that, you know, you've got the Staingate Road linking those east-west. You've got Deer Street coming from the south, one of the main roads all the way north up towards Edinburgh, which goes through Corbridge, and you've got a similar road that goes all the way through to the north from Carlisle as well. And evidence from the north is that we are describing a summons basically to our commander, and he said basically, I want you to go and see the centurion in charge of the region at Carlisle at Lugavallium. So even from their words, it's telling us that actually Carlisle was a more important place than Vindolanda by the road. You know, sounds like he was in a bit of bother, our lad. He hadn't been doing very well about it, so he backslide over here thing. So yeah, we've got some good evidence for where the big node points are. And then interspersed, like I say, around about a half a day's march apart, you've got these big military camps, some for 500 men, some for 1,000 men, and they're basically just housing the general police force of the Roman Empire, the auxiliaries, who are just engaged in sort of monitoring the situation over the north of Britain during the Roman occupation. So to the Romans themselves, it's not all that of an important place, but archaeologically now it's huge. See it over there where we've had to go down about what 6 inches and we've come across a Roman road surface, so it's really not very well buried at all there. It's quite an explosive site, so you're getting quite a lot of wet room, which I think we're about to get back at any minute. And it basically keeps scouring the soil off the top of it. Other places that we've dug, like the lee side of the fort over there, there's been buried with 4 or 5 feet of topsoil before we got to archaeology. Just here it was really close to the surface. That wall there